So a very good day to one and all, and a warm welcome to the 21st talk of the Society weekly webinar series on Ecoswaraj towards a green, red, blue recovery for India by Ashish Kothari, Environmentalist of Kalpaviksh, Vikalp, Sangam. Firstly, introducing myself, I'm Fida Fatima, and I'm really privileged to be moderating today's session. And firstly, as we move on to our session, I would like to request Gina AK of the IEEE Engineering in Medicine and Biology Society to welcome the gathering. Can we have you?
Yeah, hi Fida. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So good evening, all of you. I'm really glad to present the welcome address representing IEEE EMBS Kerala chapter on this evening of the successful 21st talk of Intersociety weekly webinar series. And I'm really amazed at the continued works of Intersociety in this pandemic situation, starting from April 15, coming up with exciting speakers and innovating ideas of speech. And looking into today's topic of the session, I was thinking how important it is to make aware about our people, about the protection of our environment and the importance of the environment. And the title itself is an eye-opener to all of us. Ecoswaraj towards a green, red, blue recovery of India. And for that, we have a very justified speaker, I should say, Mr. Ashish Kothari, a well-known environmentalist, founder of Kalpavriksh, Vikalp Sangam. With utmost honor and privilege, I deem it my honor to welcome you, sir, to this blissful evening. It's also honor for me to welcome the chairman of Center for Environment and Development, senior member of IEEE, Professor V.K. Damodaran, sir, to this occasion. Welcome you, sir. Despite of our busy schedules, we have Dr. Sultana Bashir from Vakkom Moulavi Foundation Trust. I would consider it as my honor to welcome you, ma'am, also to this occasion. Now we have Harindra Lal, sir, from Intersociety, who has been the backbone of this wonderful sessions that have been going on all these Wednesdays starting from April and reaching to the 21st talk. I should say it has been a successful event, and I consider it as my honor to welcome Harindra Lal, sir, to this occasion also. Welcome you, sir. And Ms. Fida from Intersociety Activities Committee has been monitoring the sessions, and welcome you, Fida, to this occasion. I also consider it as my honor to welcome all the IEEE Kerala section members, Institute of Engineers India Kerala state members, Intersociety Trivandrum Chapter members, Computer Society India Development Chapter members, Project Management Institute Kerala Chapter members, Vakkom Moulavi Foundation Trust Trivandrum members, and Engineering in Medicine and Biology Society members to this occasion. It was always an honor to have the best count of participations in all these sessions, and today also we have a count of 50 plus audience here, and hope much more will be joining us soon. Welcome all of you to this occasion. I hope you'll all have a wonderful evening ahead with Ashish. So welcome all of you once again, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Now, I would like to request Dr. Sultana Bashir of the Vakkom Moulavi Foundation Trust to introduce the speaker. Can we have you, ma'am?
Thank you very much. And thank you for all the introductions. So first, a big thank you to Ashish for agreeing to give this talk, as he is a very busy person and always not so much on the move now with COVID, but it is really my great pleasure and honor to introduce his former colleague and very good friend of mine to give today's webinar, today's lecture. So some of you, of course, may know him because he has been very active in India's environmental movement for over 4 decades, having co-founded Kalpavriksh when he was still at school. And he remains very actively engaged with Kalpavriksh, but not just Kalpavriksh, but many other things internationally as well. I first met Ashish, I think it was in the late 80s in Delhi when he was co-leading a Ministry of Environment project on human-nature interaction around several national parks in India. And I believe he was also lecturing at the Indian Institute of Public Administration at that time. We were all based in Delhi. And one of the things that Ashish throughout his career has been concerned with, apart from being a great naturalist and passionate about conservation, biodiversity, he has also always been equally committed to issues relating to social justice. And that has been the leitmotif of his career, both in India and internationally. And he has done a huge amount of work on raising understanding, awareness about the importance of local communities, indigenous peoples, access to not just access to natural resources, but also to recognize that such communities have a long history of managing their natural environment. They're often very closely intertwined with them culturally. They have a lot of traditional knowledge that we don't recognize, that we don't value sufficiently in the mainstream. So he has been a real mover and shaker in bringing about greater awareness and pushing for recognition of these issues in mainstream conservation and the environmental agenda generally. And he's been extremely active over the decades in various very important people's movements on environmental issues, and you can read about it in his CV. And now at the moment in Kalpaviksh, he is leading Kalpavriksh's program on something called alternatives, looking at what are the things we need to do to sustain our future. Actually, we've had several talks in this series which have looked at the impact of COVID, the implications for recovery. We've also had a talk on climate change and the impacts of this. And several speakers have already mentioned that the COVID has impacted us on top of existing crises, ecological crises, social crises, economic crises, and that we must not forget these underlying crises in the rush to build back and to recover post-COVID. And I think Ashish is going to give us some real insights and also some interesting cases of things that people are doing. Often we do not know what is happening around the country and elsewhere in the world and what is possible. So with these, I would like to welcome Ashish to give his talk, and I'm sure you're all very much looking forward to hearing what he has to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Am I audible? That's the first question these days now one has to ask.
Yes, you're audible.
Thanks a lot.
You're audible.
Thank you. Thanks to Intersociety, IEEE, and all the other organizers for this opportunity. It's always actually a great opportunity. For me, it's always wonderful to be able to talk to people who are outside the normal environmental circles or human rights circles, because it's so crucial that we have these sorts of dialogues across all sorts of different sectors to see what we can also do together, or how at least we can arrive at some sort of a common understanding. Thanks, Sultana, for for inviting me in the first place and making this possible, and for that embarrassing introduction. Trust you to do that. So I'm going to get straight into the presentation. I will share slides. One of the things I want to say, and the reason for the title of the presentation, which is moving towards a rainbow recovery, is because fairly early on in the work that I and a number of others did as young people on the environment, we realized that you can't look at or think of or protect the environment unless one is also looking at its connections with all other aspects of life, the political, the economic, the social, the cultural, and so on. And over the last 4 decades, we've kind of understood that more and more, that one has to take a very intersectional, cross-sectoral approach to be able to solve any of the problems we have, whether it's environmental crisis or it's poverty or hunger or anything else. And so the presentation I'm going to make is will range across a diversity of these sorts of issues, and not just what conventionally is thought of as environment. But I hope that in doing that, it makes some amount of sense. So please let me know if these slides are visible. Is this full?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Yes, full screen.
All right. So actually, in many parts of the world, and especially in the United States and Europe, there's a lot of discussion about a Green New Deal. The former candidate for US presidency, Bernie Sanders, in UK, the Prime Minister candidate, Jeremy Corbyn, and now the European Parliament, and many others are talking about a Green New Deal. And while that's actually very welcome, because any kind of recovery out of COVID needs to take environment as a very central focus, as the most important focus, I would say. These sorts of recovery plans also need to look at issues of social justice, economic justice, and so on. And so I tend to think of this not just as green in a conventional environmental sense, but a much broader way. And that's what I'll try and deal with in today's presentation. Right now, so the backdrop to this, of course, is India's. I'll largely focus on India, but also talk a little bit about some of the things happening in other parts of the world. But largely, the focus is for ourselves here in India. India is, one image of India is what you see on this slide, which is rapidly has moved into the 21st century, very high until recently, very high rates of economic growth, GDP growth, per capita income, material consumption, the number of cars and mobile phones and so on and so forth per capita have been steadily rising. And so India is claiming that we are already moving into the category of developed countries. We now are the 5th largest economy in the world and so on. And this is certainly a part of the picture. I don't want to deny it. I think that's certainly an important part of the picture. But what it hides, and unfortunately is covered less and less these days by policy making and by the media, is that we've somewhere lost track of the fundamental notion of what development itself is. If you look at the origin of the word development, it's kind of the opposite of envelopment, which means envelopment is to enclose, so development is to open up. So coming from either biology, like the embryo, the human embryo becoming, giving birth, becoming a baby, becoming an adult and so on, or a seed becoming a plant and then a full grown tree. From that, the analogy was that development should be about the opening up of opportunities for all of us in multiple different human dimensions. Unfortunately, over the last few decades, development has basically come to mean material growth, and that also much more narrowly financial or economic growth measured in all countries of the world except Bhutan, and I think more recently New Zealand, through GDP. Now, I don't have the time to get into the how nonsensical GDP as a development parameter is, but basically that's what it has meant. And so therefore, everything is measured in terms of whether it will increase GDP or not. And I think it's very important for us to realize that development itself, which is considered by all of us to be sacrosanct, it's like if I ask somebody, do we really need development? They'll look at me and say, are you mad? It's like you're asking, do you need oxygen? But actually development is, is post-World War II. The word was never used in an economic context before that. And it came about in a certain context of the Western countries wanting to rebuild their economies and pushing a certain ideology of what it means to be developed. And so then comes this whole unilinear sort of thing of developed, developing, underdeveloped, or undeveloped. And we've all accepted that completely blindly, without looking at the multiple different nuances or complexities of each of the societies that we're living in, using just that, as I said, narrow indicator of GDP. Now, what that means is that when we have an ideology which says development at any cost, which means economic growth at any cost, it literally is at any cost. So if you look at this advertisement by an Indian multinational corporation, it says that we have a certain notion of growth and development, and if nature as a barrier is in the way, you need to uproot it. Rip the oceans, rip the forests in jungles in Indonesia and lay pipelines. Now, probably no advertisement agency will put out an ad like that anymore because ecology is suddenly fashionable. But the notion of development is still exactly this. And you see it right now, even in the COVID period, when we realize how important it is to protect the environment. COVID, after all, is an outcome of ecological devastation, which is proven quite extensively in science. Even then, we have a government which is actually giving clearances in the middle of India's most biologically diverse forests, in central India for coal mining, in the Western Ghats for railway lines, all kinds of stuff in the Himalaya for the so-called Char Dham project and so on. So in that sense, development has actually come to mean violence against nature, but also then violence against people who depend directly on nature for their livelihoods. In India, at least 600, 700 million people are directly day-to-day dependent on the land, on forests, on wetlands, on coastal areas, marine areas for their livelihoods and their survival. And when you destroy the environment, you're also actually undermining their livelihood possibilities. Now, we know that for the planet as a whole, this growth-based development has actually become cancerous. Whether you take it in terms of the loss of biological diversity, or now especially more and more we realize through climate crisis. We are already crossing several boundaries that we should have been living within. We can't cross planetary boundaries without it rebounding on us in all kinds of terrible ways. We're already using 1.5 times the resources that the Earth can replenish in its natural cycles. And we have a runaway climate crisis at our doorstep. It's no longer in the future. It's already upon us. Even in India, there was a study that was done by the Confederation of Indian Industries and the Global Footprint Network, which showed, this is 10 years back, which showed that we were already using twice our biological capacity in terms of land and forests and water and so on. So here's some statistics of what we've done to the environment in the name of development, partly through the colonial period, especially with forests, but then also largely in independent India, and then especially in the last 30 years after 1991, when we moved into a global economic globalization phase. The impacts of this are both on other species that coexist with us. So more than 10% of India's wildlife is threatened with extinction. And then on people who, as I said, live or depend directly on nature and natural resources for their livelihoods. Now, it's often told to us that this is an inevitable path that all countries have to go through. You know, the same unilinear thing of moving from underdeveloped to developing to developed, that there will be environmental destruction. But then when we become rich enough, we will put money back into invested back into protecting the environment. And why? Because we have to do this to move people out of poverty, to provide employment and so on. A colleague, Asim Srivastava, and I did a book about 5-6 years back, going into a great amount of detail, looking mostly at government statistics themselves to see, okay, what has really happened with regard to things like employment and poverty. And this is what we came across, and I'll show you an image of the book so you can look at it yourself. 1991 onwards, when we moved into the globalization phase, as I said, where a lot more investment was going into the formal sector of industry and government and so on, we've got a situation today where 90% of workforce is in the informal sector, extremely vulnerable. A lot of them, as we have seen in COVID times, they're the ones who are suffering the worst. Poverty, if it's taken not so much in terms of the $1.5 a day or whatever other criteria, financial criteria that are used, but if you take it in terms of, do people have access to just the basic needs, clean drinking water, clean air, good, adequate, nutritious food, housing, sanitation, health, and education, and whatever other basic needs we think of, and energy, sorry. Then according to us, at least 70% of India is actually still poor. And not just still poor, those who in fact were relatively better off, if they still had intact coastal or marine ecosystems or forest ecosystems or grasslands to live on, have also now been pushed into situations of this kind of deprivation of some of the other. And if you look at that statistics, it's astounding. 60 million people, 6 crore people displaced, physically uprooted by so-called development projects, mining, industries, highways, bullet trains, blah, 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 everything that you can think of over the last 60 years or so. And these are people who actually, the vast majority of them, according to the former Planning Commission, were never given proper resettlement. They've had to go and fend for themselves. And they are often the ones who are the worst off in terms of migrant labor or completely insecure jobs or no jobs at all. And so they're sort of newly important in many ways. And like I keep saying, COVID, I think, has been, I should say, a sort of a shocker, should have been a wake-up call for us. I don't know if it actually is or not. which has told us the deep fault lines in our society, economic, social, ecological fault lines, which have created this incredible amount of vulnerability that you have an economic lockdown because of COVID, and you get tens of millions of people who are now either out of jobs or having to basically survive on very little. Now, I think this is also something that's very, very crucial around the world, and including in India, that you see that all this economic growth that has taken place, it obviously must be going somewhere. There is a lot more money in the Indian economy, if it's the 5th largest economy in the world. And what we've seen is actually a significantly growing inequality between the rich and the poor. This has steadily grown in the last 20, 30 years or so. In fact, even just in the last 5 years, it's grown significantly, where now 5% of Indians earn as much as the rest of the 95%. And we can see that there are some people who are actually getting richer and richer. And it's, to my mind, a rather interesting situation that a city which has at least 40% of its population without adequate housing also has the world's largest single family house. I'm sure all of you know whose house that is. And finally, also then, what this enables is that for people like us, I guess most of the people on this call, if we could afford to have a laptop or a computer and be on a digital call like this, we're probably amongst the top 5%, or maybe even the richest 1% of India, which is consuming 17 times on average what the poorest are consuming. So it's not a population issue per se. Of course, that is an issue, but it's actually even more so a consumption issue, or a patterns of consumption issue. And when India, for instance, goes abroad and says that we have amongst the lowest per capita carbon emissions in the world, which is true, what essentially we're doing is that us 50 million, 100 million people who are significantly over consuming are hiding behind the poor, because we're using that average for continuing our completely wasteful consumption patterns. And I think this is something also where I said there's violence against nature, violence against communities, especially those dependent on nature. But in a way, it's also a violence against each one of us. If you look at it, what's happened with this kind of economic globalization, modernization, modernity, etc., is that it's given us a lot of good things, of course, but it's also moved us away from livelihoods that where occupations were embedded within society and culture and social relationships and ecological relationships and so on, into jobs, so that jobs are now separated from entertainment or enjoyment, which is why we have this weekday and weekend concept. We never had that traditionally in any society anywhere in the world, but the West has given us this idea of 5 days of the work, 9 to 5, 5 days of the week, 9 to 5 you work, after 5 o'clock you enjoy yourself, on the weekends you enjoy yourself, and then you have vacations where you try and enjoy yourself, then you come back into, for what is, for the most part, for most people in the world in this modern occupations, very boring, soul deadening jobs. So I call that a move from livelihoods to deadlihoods. I am, of course, being simplistic here because of lack of time, but I think this is very much a dominant part of reality. And of course, then we've moved so far away from the ideals of some of the people who helped us to gain independence, that if a Gandhiji was to come back and visit any of the MG roads in any of our cities, he would be a very, very confused person. Much more detail on this, on the bad news side of the picture is there in this book, 300 pages of analysis, which you can read. This came out in 2012, hopefully still available in the market. But from there, I also want to, very quickly point to the fact that right now, with COVID, what it has done, as I keep saying, is that it's actually given us a wake-up call. It's told us we need to really fundamentally rethink humanity's relationship with the planet and people relationship within human beings themselves. And we can go in either direction. We can either go the way the state and market is going, which is more authoritarianism, more excuse for state surveillance, etc., and markets, like, for instance, the 5 richest people in the world have become double richer in the time of COVID. That includes Facebook and Amazon and so on and so forth. Or we can look at the fundamental shifts that we need in the economy and society to see, can we move towards more social justice, more economic equality, more ecological sustainability. And it is the second direction that I want to turn to now, which is about saying that this is not just an abstract notion, it's really looking at what's already available out there that we can learn from. So I'm going to go through a series of examples of where people are firstly resisting this kind of completely unjust and unsustainable model of development and the roots of that. And secondly, trying to build alternatives in different fields to meet their needs, to meet their aspirations. Because it's not as if we're saying that we have to stay where we are. There is deprivation, there is hunger, there is poverty, and it needs to be dealt with. So over the last few years, my organization and a number of others across the country have been either documenting or working with or supporting or being part of these kinds of grounded alternatives. And I'll give you just a few examples today. Let's take food, so fundamental to all of our lives. None of us can do without it. The conventional notion in India of agricultural development has been the Green Revolution, which means hybrid seeds, chemicals, fertilizers, etc., etc. And that has created huge amounts of problems, both ecological and social and economic, as we can see, for instance, across the Punjab, Haryana belt and many other places. Now, we were told there's no alternative to it. So I want to give this example because to my mind, it's such an incredible radical alternative that we have to sit up and listen to it. This is 5,000 Dalit and Adivasi women farmers in Telangana, who as Dalit women or Adivasi women are already on the margins of society, exploited and so on. Over the last 30 years, from a situation of hunger, malnutrition and so on, they've actually moved to a situation of what they call not just food security, but food sovereignty, which means taking full control over everything to do with food. No dependence on the government, no dependence on corporations. By collectivizing their activities, by bringing back their traditional seeds, by going completely organic, by working out how to work with non-irrigated dry lands and being extremely productive in that, creating a grain bank in every village, creating a local public distribution system so that cheap but healthy food grains is available to local families, and much else. This itself could be a full 1 hour session, just this one example. It's an extremely inspiring one. And through that kind of transformation in their agriculture, they've also transformed their social lives as women and as Dalits to have much more respect in their villages compared to what they had. 30 years after being hungry and malnourished and all, today, their agriculture is so successful that they are actually contributing to the COVID relief work in the district. And they're feeding 1,000 glasses of millet porridge every day in the town of Zahirabad to workers who are active with COVID. A second example is from Uttarakhand. This is again, it's a women's group that started working on issues of domestic violence against women and children, and then moved into looking at how women could be economically more independent with the twin focus of traditional livelihoods, that is crafts and making products out of wool, but also the modern sector, that is ecotourism, completely controlled by the community, homestays where visitors like me can go and actually have their food, enjoy their culture, their hospitality, look at nature through their eyes and so on, and not go like a typical tourist, which is usually quite destructive. Now, there are many examples like this. I don't want to go into too much detail. I think many of you on the call are from Kerala, so I'm sure many of you are aware of Kudumbashri as a program that is state supported. Another state supported one was Jharcraft in Jharkhand, which has enabled much more dignified and sustainable livelihoods for lakhs of people in these two states in their own villages, not having to migrate to cities or industrial zones for work. Similarly, in Maharashtra, these two villages, Ralegan Siddhi, which is Bazaar, Kunaria and Kutch, which has recently shown incredible amount of local initiative in making sure that community health systems are in place to deal with COVID, but also that livelihood options are available even through the economic lockdown, and many others. What I think is very important in all of these is that there's a range of options available. It's not just agriculture, not just fisheries, but also small scale manufacturing, also crafts, also services that can in fact revitalize the rural economy so much that not just out migration is stopped, but in fact the reverse migration also has taken place. Coming to a couple of examples from cities. This is Bhuj in Kutch, where in 3 or 4 of the so-called slum colonies, there has been significant amount of empowerment of the people to be able to be part of the planning and decision making and budgeting for their colonies. And they are deciding what kind of housing, what kind of garbage management, what kind of energy systems, access roads, etc. Should be made. Now, so from a situation of being a really badly affected slum to what you see on the top right hand side there, a very decent and dignified living conditions is what they've achieved through this. And the essential lesson here is that as citizens of a city also, we need to be at the core of decision making, not just the corporators and the politicians. Similarly, middle class actions here in Bangalore, for instance, we see where more aware middle class people have revived a lake that had been destroyed and that was being eyed by the land mafia. And you can imagine the kind of land prices in Bangalore that would be at stake. Or another one called Rainbow Drive, where they're now doing 100% waste recycling, 100% water recycling, and so on. Or the coming back of zero waste shops. I remember when I was small, I could go to a shop and buy things without any plastic packaging, or the multiple layers of completely ecologically unfriendly packaging, which is gone now. All of our shops are full of this kind of completely wasteful packaging. But now we're beginning to come back with zero waste retail shops like this one in Goa. In Pune now we have 3 or 4. One problem, of course, is that they're now available only for the rich. So how do we also make these kinds of things available to the urban poor is a question mark. I'm going to move now to a couple of examples of where we move from the economy into politics. So this is a federation of 90 Gram Sabhas, or villages in central India, heavily forested area, also area where Naxalism is very active, which have first of all mobilized themselves to stop mining in their forests because it's very destructive, but also then say that we should be controlling the forest and earning from it instead of industries, that we should be asserting our own Adivasi identity. We're not Hindus, we're not Christians, nothing. We are Adivasis and we have our own culture and our own history. That we should also be enabling women to be as central part of decision-making processes as the men are, and so on and so forth. So the multiple different kinds of transformations that they're arguing. But the base of this is what another village in the same district said 30 years back, that while we elect the government in Mumbai and Delhi, in our village, we are the government. Nobody else will take decisions for us. We will be the ones taking decisions. And of course, those of you from Kerala would know that Kerala has also moved to some extent in that direction of having people's planning processes and so on. So for conservation, also, as Sultana mentioned right at the beginning, one of our earliest movements was to challenge the kind of top-down exclusionary conservation where you say, okay, tiger has to be protected, the forest department will do it, kick all the Adivasis out and we will fence it off. Instead of that, what we've been arguing for is a people-centered, a community-centered conservation process in which people and their own knowledge systems are as much part of the process as the state or as the forest department might be, or in fact, they manage it themselves. And there are hundreds of examples in India of this kind of community conservation. Last couple of things I'll say, and then I'll talk about sort of overall framework that emerges from this of the rainbow recovery. I think all of this will also not be possible unless we fundamentally alter our education and media spaces. The education that I went through in school, and I'm sure most of us on this call would have gone through, does not in fact teach us most of these things. It teaches us to be selfish, individualistic, not questioning our teachers, and basically figuring out how best to fit into an existing system, to be another cog in the wheel. And of course, there's very little about nature and natural resources in the way we learn. So these are alternatives, just a handful of them. There's many others in the country where there's an attempt to actually create a learning environment in which children are able to relate back to their own ecologies, their own cultures, but also learn about other cultures and so on, and be proud of their heritage, but also learn from outside, and to be questioning and to be responsible, so that you're working not as an individual selfish person who wants to come first in class, but you're working as a responsible collective person who wants to make sure that all the children are actually moving up into the next class. Similarly, with media, attempts at trying to regain some level of control over the mainstream media, but also create a lot of alternative media. Now with the so-called social media, that is even more possible, that you're able to create channels of communication for the voices that are heard. And I think a great example of that right now was the massive online protest by children across the country and youth across the country against the very destructive environmental impact assessment notification that the government has tried to push through. So communications, media, education, all of that becomes important. Now, when these sorts of things happen, when there's an upsurge from people where they're showing what's practically possible, they're talking about policy shifts, etc., and governments also respond. We've seen in the earlier part of, I think, the first UPA government, how a number of, or before that in the 90s, how a number of either constitutional or legal changes came in, which were much more rights-based, which were much more talking about how people's entitlements and the environment have to be protected and safeguarded. And we're also seeing many, many different programs and policies in different states. For instance, on organic farming, I don't know what the latest target for Kerala is. I was told it used to be 2020, but it's probably shifted. But a number of states have moved into supporting farmers who want to do organic farming, or for instance, supporting renewable energy, or like the Kerala example of Kodumbushi that I already mentioned. So you can, I mean, the government is not a monolith. One can actually get policy shifts happening if there's adequate people's pressure and also guidance and direction. Very quickly, to talk about the global situation, the problem part of what I said in India is actually globally the case, that is of ecological destruction and inequality and so on. But I want to talk about how across the globe, you actually see multiple different examples of these kinds of alternative ways of solving problems, meeting needs, and so on. Oh, sorry, I should also point to this map. A lot of you might see this map and think it's upside down. And that itself is a very interesting phenomenon, because the map that we are used to, which we think is the normal map, is actually a map that was made in colonial times. And it was made so that Europe is on top and looks much bigger than it actually is. This map shows you the actual sizes of the continents, and you can see how small Western Europe, for instance, suddenly is. And so it's a very decolonial way of looking at the map. Because if you're looking at the Earth from space, there's not necessity that Europe has to be on top. It could be at the bottom. But also to show you examples of alternatives from around the world. And I'll just give you 2 or 3 very quick examples of what's happening. This is, to me, very, very inspiring, because this is a movement for peace and ecological well-being in the midst of probably one of the world's most war-torn zones. That's the intersection between Turkey, Iran, Syria, and Iraq. And you have the Kurdish ethnic community living there, which has tried to create this zone of peace built on ecological and feminist principles, and very deep direct democracy where everybody is part of local assemblies and can take part in decision making. Or you have these wonderful examples from many parts of Europe, where young people are actually coming up with things like non-profit cafes or non-profit shops, where they're saying that, of course, we have to, whatever investment we make, we need to bring back the revenues, but we're not into making profits. We're not a capitalist organization. We want to have fun. And the way to do it is to set up a solidarity cafe or a social cafe. Or, for instance, a school in Greece that is run very high quality teaching, but very cheap, so that local poor people can also afford it. And the way they do it is by parents actually offering to do free teaching or free services of various kinds. It's called time banking. And this is another big movement in different parts of the world, where you say, can at least some part of our economic exchanges be without money? Can we bring back either barter or other kinds of systems that we traditionally had, but in a new context? And a lot of what's called municipalism, which is to say, okay, the governance of cities also, or of small municipal areas, can be done through these kind of alternative ways. Barcelona, for instance, has had a woman governor for the last, I think, 6 or 7 years. And Ada Colau, the person, she has been trying to move much more into working with the opposition parties, always keeping her eye on the ground to see what are people's movements saying, what is coming out from residents associations, etc., to create a city, or try and move the city into a direction that is much more people friendly and environment friendly. There's similar either ecological or feminist or different kinds of sort of marginalized populations talking about COVID recovery plans, which are based on bailing out or supporting the most marginal populations, not bailing out the airlines industry or the big banks, etc., which is unfortunately what most governments, including ours, is doing. So I'm going to move quickly into, and then open it up for discussion, is what's the kind of framework broadly that's emerging from this? What kind of alternative society can we think of based on these and many other examples and the questions that we've been asking? So a couple of us have called it Ecoswaraj or Prakritik Swaraj, or radical ecological democracy. And I think it's very important to go back to the roots of what radical means. Radical doesn't mean killing each other or being extremist. It means going to the roots, which is actually very good. So if we had radicalized people and youth, that would be fantastic. But so what's the notion, the concept? The concept is very simple. Wherever we are, in whatever space, a village, urban neighborhood, a school, an institution, whatever it is, we should all assert our right to be part of decision making. But as we assert that, we also understand that we have a responsibility to others. And by others, I mean other people, but also other species. And that's why a radical ecological democracy. And if we do that, then it's the collective at the ground level where it matters the most. That becomes the center of decision making, not the state at the center, nor the private corporation. And so the 5 transformations we're talking about very quickly. The top right hand of this Olympics-like figure that you see here, the top right hand sphere, is what the villages in central India are arguing. That democracy is about us being part of decision making. Hamare gaon mein hum hi sarkar. We are the government in our village. And then moving from that to looking at what would be the governance structures right from that small community up to the globe, where we also then make representative institutions like the government much more accountable to things that are happening on the ground. The second sphere on below it is economic democracy, which is like what the Dalit women farmers are saying, that if it's to do with food, we have to be in control. Similarly, others are talking about energy sovereignty, or if it's workers in an industry, saying workers are the ones who should be controlling the process and managing and owning it rather than some capitalist producer or the state. But also that the economy is much more about caring and sharing. It's about also recognizing, for instance, the incredible invisible role that women play, which is never accounted for in our GDP kind of models. The third sphere below that is of social justice, which is so important in a society in which casteism, gender inequality, etc., are so rampant that the struggles for those kind of for more justice and more equality are also a very important part of that. The fourth sphere is of cultural diversity and knowledge diversity. Virtually all the examples that I've given you in this presentation are of mixing and matching and doing hybrids of traditional knowledge, modern knowledge, local ways of dealing with things, with maybe learning also from outside, and also having cultural exchanges all the time across the globe. But then recognizing and respecting the fact that your culture is to be as respected as mine, and not imposing this one religion or one ethnicity or one whatever, which is unfortunately what's happening now in many countries. And finally, also, of course, the fundamental basis of ecology and environment, because without that, we're all dead anyway. There's a lot more on this in these. I'm just going to skip all of this. The slideshow is available for anybody who wants to use it. One of the important things for us to do, if we look at it from this perspective, is also to constantly question what the state or the corporations are giving us. Right now, for instance, there's a lot of talk about self-reliance. Certainly, Atmanirbharta has become the buzzword. But what the government today means about it is very, very different from what communities are talking about. For instance, handlooms are being driven out, and in their place, industry is coming in. that to my mind is not about self-reliance. Self-reliance should be about the fact that in India, people already make. We don't need to invite hundreds of industries from outside to make in India. So I'm skipping all of this. These are just elaborations of what I spoke about. The last slide, and then I'll take a minute on some processes that we're doing. I think this is the most important slide, because I get asked this question often, saying, look, how do you replicate a Deccan Development Society or a Mendha Lekha or a Korchi or whatever somewhere else? And the idea is not to replicate, because every place is different. But how do you look at the principles that have emerged, the processes that have emerged, and the values and the ethics that are emerging from these examples? And I think that's the most important thing to learn. We can learn that and then apply it in our own context. And obviously, we don't have the time for me to go into all of these things. But for instance, let's take number 4. When I mentioned education or the economy, the alternative examples of moving towards justice and sustainability are all about working as a collective, working with the commons, not with the privatized, individualistic, selfish way in which, unfortunately, modern society has told us to live. Or if we take, for instance, the 6th or 7th bullet point about happiness, it gives me happiness to go shopping, which is why it's called retail therapy, or it gives me more happiness to have better social relationships within my family, in my neighborhood, with people like you, have learning experiences, be able to go out and enjoy nature, etc. We need to be able to make those choices, because otherwise we're living this, in a way, artificial world of always thinking of ourselves as being happy and contented because we just have more and more and more material possessions. So there's many different values. Like I said, we don't have time to go into all of these, but this is a very different set of ethics than what modern development has taught us. And it's really about celebrating life, where all life and living beings are important in themselves. We can't think of treating nature or other people as commodities to exploit, which is what development does. So the last thing is to talk about a process that we use to try and bring a lot of people together, to share with each other these sorts of experiences and ideas and practices, to collaborate more across sectors, especially across the entire range of human activity in different parts of India. And so these are physical Sangams that are held. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to in the last 5 months, of course, or then there are also exchanges, online exchanges of stories, of case studies, of materials, of visions. So these are some of the books that have come out of this process. The 2 on the left hand and right hand side are based in India. The one in the middle is 100 examples of these sorts of alternatives from around the world. They're all available online. In fact, all of them also available free for free download. And in the last year or so, we've also initiated a process similar to Vikalp Sangam, but more globally, looking at how one can weave together the different kinds of radical alternatives that I gave you some examples of, and there are many, many thousands more, to be able to create more of a critical mass for affecting both national and global changes. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that we have all the answers. In fact, we have probably more questions than answers. I'm just putting some up there. So for instance, if we move to this kind of a radical democracy, do we still need a central state? If so, what would be its role? How do you move from a radical democracy on a village level up to global governance? Can it be, is it the United Nations or is it something beyond the United Nations? How do peoples get represented at that global level? What would business look like? If I keep talking against capitalism, for instance, can we have non-capitalist businesses that are controlled and managed by communities? And how do professions, like for instance, many that you're from, also transform themselves to be able to look at these sorts of things? And I think that is a crucial thing. How do we assume responsibility also in our professions? I just had a session before this with students of architecture in Ahmedabad. And one of the big questions there was, when I work as an architect, I work with a client to make a building. Is that the only relationship I should be concerned about? Or should I also be concerned about what is the impact of that building on the rest of society and on the ecology? In which case, my relationship is also with nature and with other people in society who might be impacted by my construction activities. And the same would go for all or any kind of profession, to sort of broaden our scope much more, to look at responsibility, ethics, codes of ethics, and so on, which we may have, but maybe we need to expand and modify, and also, of course, implement. So I'm sorry, that's been a kind of a rapid process, presentation through lots of different and complex issues. I'm sorry if I've also been simplistic in the process because 1 hour is just too short for this. But I hope I've opened up some questions and issues, and then we can have a bit of a discussion on this. And that's my email for anybody who wants to be in touch later. Thank you. I will stop share and then we can open it up for discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ashish. Sorry, go ahead, sir. Go ahead.
Sultana, may I take the liberty of giving you the Q&A session, handling the Q&A session?
Yes, certainly, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ashish. And that was a very interesting talk. You covered a lot of ground in a very short space of time. And as you say, yes, it requires, you could do a talk on each bit of this quick run through things. I will not take up too much time so there can be questions, but I can come back to some more after we deal with questions from the participants. I would also just urge all of you to look up some of the links that Ashish has included, to look at the work he's doing through the Vikalp, Sangam, and other groups. And one of the things I find most heartening is these examples from all across India of extraordinary people, just, you know, what we would call ordinary, non-professional people doing amazing things, like the women in the Deccan Society, the Adivasis who are uniting to try and reclaim their rights. And there has never been a more critical time for everyone to come together to address these huge challenges we are facing as a society, not just in India, but globally. So let me go to the questions that we have at the moment. So we have a question from Francis Joseph, who asks, are other countries trying to shift their most polluting industries to India by exploiting Make in India concept?
Yes, indeed. And this is a process that's been going on for quite some time now, for the last few decades, where because of either, can we switch the screen share off? Because I'm not able to see anybody.
Yeah,
do we need the slide on?
Why not? Yeah.
Yeah, okay, thanks. That's better. Thank you. So, yeah, for the last few decades, actually, this is, I mean, earlier what was happening in colonial times especially was that the colonies were being exploited for raw materials, which were then taken to the so-called industrial or industrializing countries and exploited and used there. And then we were sold back the products out of that. Now, increasingly, what's happening in the last 2, 3, 4 decades is that the industries themselves are being shifted to our countries, because of the fact that over there's much stronger environmental movements or human rights movements, or labor and so on has become much more expensive, whereas it's still cheap in India, or you can still locate industries because nobody's protesting. So yes, that is very much the case. And unfortunately, even in COVID times, the government has entered into, or is trying to enter into, MOUs with companies in many parts of the world to come here, including those companies who no longer want to be in China, where also they were exploiting local labor and so on. But now, because of COVID, you know, China suddenly becoming untouchable, they are looking for other avenues. So India is attracting them. Also, in our book, Churning the Earth, we have documented the significant rise of toxic waste coming into India. That's an amazing thing. I don't know, we don't seem to have any self-dignity at all. So we import some of the worst wastes, electronic and other toxic wastes from around the world in the name of development. And incidentally, if you look at the trade, the export-import documents, they're not called waste, it's called used goods. Like, that suddenly makes it nice because it's goods. So that is definitely one of the things that's happening, and we have to be able to resist that.
Thank you, Ashish. The next question is from Mr. Narayanan Nair Ravindranath, and it is, in India, decisions on governance are from top down, not taking into consideration of the views of people in India at large. What are your observations on this, and how can this situation be corrected?
Yeah, so like I pointed out, I think our notion of democracy has been a very limited notion, where we think of democracy as being something where we go to vote once in 5 years and then we try and we desperately hope that the government we have elected or somebody else has elected will do the right thing. Whereas what the examples I've shown you have said is that decision making needs to be as much in the hands of those who are going to be impacted by the decisions as in the hands of bureaucrats or politicians, or actually even more so. There was a movement in Jharkhand called Pattalgadi, which gave the slogan saying, Lok Sabha se upar Gram Sabha. And if you actually look at the spirit of our constitution, we the people, or the 73rd and 74th amendments, they're actually about empowering institutions of self-governance. That is the Gram Sabha, the Panchayat, or the urban local body, the area Sabha, etc., etc. And like I said, Kerala has moved somewhat in that direction, not fully, but somewhat. And so we have to be able to take the 73rd, 74th amendments or laws like Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act that much further to their logical conclusions by saying that even with financial and legal powers need to be decentralized, but these two are not yet decentralized. Most of the money is still controlled by government departments or now by corporations. So that kind of local empowerment is absolutely essential. That by itself will not solve all the problems, because it's not as if suddenly you transfer power to a village and everything will be great. Of course not. People have either lost their capacities to self-govern, or there are lots of local conflicts, etc., also local inequalities. So it has to also be a gradual process of building capacity and rebuilding the institutions on the ground. But we can't, because of that, we can't say that we should not decentralize. I mean, that's exactly what the British told us. They said, you're not ready for independence, you can't govern yourself. But we fought for independence, we got it. And that's what communities are also saying, that we need to have the autonomy to make decisions that impact our lives, or at least to be a central part of those decisions. So we have some legal support for that. We need to move it much further.
Thanks, Ashish. Next question is from Shamil Nahas, which is, what are a few day-to-day steps that we can adopt which can create meaningful impact?
There's a lot. I think depending on what class of society we belong to, and I would assume that most of us on this call are from middle or upper middle classes or upper classes, we would be living lifestyles that are ecologically unsustainable. I'm saying that for myself as much as for anybody else on this call. And so we have to become much better at, first of all, understanding the impacts of the consumer choices we make, what we buy in a market, what kind of soap we buy or toothpaste we buy or whatever it is, how we live, what we consume, what is the impact of that, how fair or just is it, and how ecologically sustainable is it. And of course, we can't make all the switches and all the changes in like overnight. It's difficult. It's difficult not only because we are used to certain behavioral ways of doing things, but also because many options may not be available. So we also then as consumers have to push for those options. We have to push, for instance, that in every part of every city, there needs to be a farmer's market where farmers can come and sell us organic food, which will then make it cheaper, but also because the money will go straight to the farmer rather than to retailers and middlemen. Or we need to have a consumer movement which looks at what are the ingredients of the products that we are buying and asks the government and asks the corporations, are these safe for us? If they're not safe, why are you using them? Most of them are unsafe. So that's about personal choices. But then personal choices have a certain limit to how far you can go. Let me give you my own example. I still cycle from home to work and back, which is about 15 kilometers a day in Pune. But every day that I do that, my heart is in my mouth because the traffic situation is so unsafe and I'm breathing in so much pollution. Not these days because of COVID, fortunately the air is cleaner, but generally I'm breathing in so much pollution. I wonder every day whether I should do it, or should I just buy a car and use a car like everybody else seems to be doing. So what this needs is a movement of people arguing for safer traffic, for cycle lanes, etc. And that's what's happening in Pune. There is now quite a strong movement to do that. So at some point, we also have to move into collective action. That could be at the level of our neighborhood, our city, the country as a whole, being part of groups and collectives and movements that can argue for the kinds of shifts, consumption shifts or production shifts that we need. But there's a lot that we can do that that I think we don't normally do, because we're not asking the right questions, or we don't have the knowledge of what the impacts of our lives are.
Thank you, Ashish. Next question is from Dr. Panikar. He would like you to comment on the double speak in health management in COVID scare, self-reliance versus total control and freedom denial.
Dr. Panikar, nice to see you again. So I think your words there are absolutely appropriate. Like I mentioned, COVID has become an excuse for many governments, including ours, to become more authoritarian, to become more of a surveillance state, to crack down on dissent and dissent and people who are asking uncomfortable questions. And in the case of health, I think because it's exposed the fact that the Indian government, and this is not just this party, all parties, for the last many years, have simply not put enough budget into healthcare, into especially the public health system. We have, I don't know, 1% or 2% of our budget, or even less than that. In fact, even the poorer countries than us have 3 or 4% of the budget in public health. We've just reduced this significantly. And one of the reasons Maharashtra is amongst the worst affected by COVID is because it has amongst the least public expenditures on health. So self-reliance should actually mean, number one, that communities should become like the example I gave you from Kutch Kunaria or Sitilingi in Tamil Nadu, where the community was so empowered to deal with its health issues that they managed to deal with COVID without any government support. Okay, everything, full physical distancing, masks, etc., everything was put into place. Whereas the majority of Indian communities simply couldn't cope because we haven't built those systems of self-reliance. We haven't supported those systems of community self-reliance or food self-reliance. And unfortunately, the Atmanirbhar Bharat package doesn't go there at all. It actually further takes away that kind of control and puts it into the hands of private sector, including with health and food and agriculture and so on. So it's worse than double speak. I mean, I think it's a really dangerous game that the government is playing, and we have to expose it, and we have to tell them that in fact here are examples of what should be done, and this is where the investments and the support need to go. Fortunately, at least Kerala is one state which has shown a somewhat different model of where community health and local food systems, etc., local provisioning systems, etc., could work, and that's why with COVID, you in Kerala were able to deal with it much better than all other states, and that's what we have to push the central government also for.
Great, thank you. There's a few more questions. One from Mr. Neelakandan to you. What's your opinion on the 2020 Kirakambalam model from Kerala? Is this practical and replicable?
With due apologies, I do follow Kerala quite a lot, but not so closely to actually know what this is. So you'll have to explain it. Maybe we can either now or later explain it to me, and then I can see if I have any comments. But there's so many people from Kerala here. I think you should be able to comment better than me.
Okay, shall we just, I'll put the other questions to you and we can come back to that one, and perhaps if Harindra Lal sir agrees, we can ask Mr. Neelakandan to tell us more. I don't know what the model is also. So the next question is from Sajida Bashir, and it is certain activities require coordination across jurisdictions. For example, broadband connectivity, communications, transport. Hence, everything cannot be community-based. Even earlier, the water tanks were maintained by the state or the king. Hence, there is a need to rethink how individual, community, and national rights interact. What is the new thinking on these aspects?
Yeah. Hello, Sajita. Again, long time. Yeah, I think that's a very, very important question. I think the issue of how a radical ecological democracy would work at different scales is an issue that still needs a lot of dialogue and experimentation. So I don't definitely have all the answers. I don't think anybody does. But here are some thoughts. We had an experiment, I think 20 years back in Rajasthan called the Arwari Sansad, or the Arwari People's Parliament, where an entire river valley of about 400 square kilometers was governed as a single unit by about 60, 70 villages together through a people's parliament that was elected in every village. It's a bit like the the Mahagram Sabha of 90 villages that I spoke about in central India. But what they said explicitly was that for us, the political decision-making unit should not be our villages or talukas, but it should be the river basin. And for 10, 12 years, they actually ran that very successfully, and then it started failing for various reasons. But it is that kind of experiment is what we need to look at to see how can we move from that local community or cluster of communities to larger and larger and larger scales. So how would, for instance, the Arvari River Basin then link to the next river basin or the mountain range or whatever, through a process of the policy of the principle of subsidiarity, which is to say, whatever can happen locally should happen locally, and it's only the rest that needs to happen, like what you're saying about coordination of communication systems or the railways or things like that. Can you then build those across larger and larger landscapes? And in that sense, there will still obviously then be a need for representative institutions. Should that be the current form of the nation state? Or can there be other forms? To take the Zapatista in Mexico or the Kurdish Rojava in the example that I gave you, where they actually work at fairly much larger scale, and they've built those systems of making sure that decision-making for the large part is still at the local level, but that larger level, landscape level management and governance can also take place through interaction. And now with digital media, that becomes so much more easy, as long as the local community is empowered to also handle and be in control of the digital media. So, and the final thing I would say there, and this is where a lot more experimentation and even sort of conceptualization is needed, we can think of South Asia or South and East Asia also as a region where we slowly begin to think of the boundaries between the countries becoming more porous, maybe eventually even dissolving, and the Sundarbans between what is now India and Bangladesh being governed as a single ecological and cultural unit, or the Tibet and Ladakh plateau, which used to be one ecological and contiguous area where wildlife could go back and forth, nomadic communities could go back and forth, again becomes like that, where the fence is taken away, the India-China fence is taken away. You all might think this is crazy thinking, but consider the fact that up till 1945, Europeans were killing each other in the millions, Germans versus everybody else, etc. Post that, you see the situation where today a European doesn't need a visa to go from one country to another country. Why can't we think of something like that for the whole of South Asia, where then you're thinking of eco-regional governance, etc. So anyway, I mean, like I said, I don't necessarily have all the answers. What will happen at a global level? How do we deal with global issues like climate crisis, etc.? We have to think of ways by which peoples are represented in a way that they're downwardly accountable. We have ancient Greek democracy to tell us how, in fact, that used to happen. We have ancient examples from India about how that could happen. Let's learn from those and get rid of all the faults that they had, but let's learn from those and see how we move this relationship between the local units and the larger governance levels. But it's an arena that needs a lot more thought and a lot more discussion and dialogue.
Okay, there's a couple more questions before we ask Mr. Neelakandan if he can clarify. I would just add to that comment about localization that we have seen that actually as an impact of COVID, there's been a return to reliance on local communities. And in the UK, at least, the government is really struggling to get people to go back to work in places like London, and to sustain that capitalist economy of people eating out and buying coffees and all this. People don't want to do that. After 5 months in lockdown, they are finding that they have a better quality of life. Many of them, not everybody, but many are finding they have a better quality of life working from home, seeing their families more, not spending all that time and money on commuting. But that's just a little aside. So there's a question from Vimala Ramakrishnan, who would like to know, if you could shed a bit more light on how much can you decentralize when money and muscle power is in the hands of the minority rich, and then sustain it and take that to a macro level?
Yes, so I think what we will have to do is to learn from the examples where they've tried that and either succeeded or failed, and we can also learn from the failures. where despite vested interests, despite being up against very strong forces, people like in the Central India example I gave you, or like what they're trying to do in Bhuj, in Kutch, have managed to decentralize significantly more than in other parts of India. And I think we need to look at those case studies and see what factors work there. What factors of community unity, what factors of maybe some civil society help and facilitation, what factors of dealing with the relationship between the community and the government. How did the communities even learn about the laws that they could apply, such as the Forest Rights Act or the Panchayat legislation, and argue that in fact constitutionally this is what our power should be. What kind of use of courts did they enter into, etc. All of these are lessons that need to be learned to actually see, okay, how can those be then transferred to other communities who are also struggling on the same question. That's from the level of the communities, and I think to me that's the most important mobilization, and people like us have a very crucial role for facilitating, for creating the exchange platforms and so on. From the side of the government, assuming that there is a government that is interested, it would be about saying, okay, how do we move new legislation? For instance, the Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act is applicable only in the scheduled Adivasi areas of the country. I think it doesn't even apply to Kerala because there is no scheduled area there, if I'm not mistaken. That kind of a law should be applicable across the whole country. In fact, in I think UPA 1, there was a move to have a new Panchayat law that would provide those powers across the whole country. And the addition of, like I said earlier, financial and legal powers also. So every law that is made in the country needs to go through a consultation process with people who it's going to impact. So that's what legal power, decentralized legal powers would be. Decentralized financial powers would be, instead of departments controlling all the or most of the money, it should be local. There is Nagaland has something called the Communitization Act, in which communities have control over something like 30% of every department's budget. So the village council can decide what to do with it. So that's the direction we have to fight for. And this also relates to Dr. Panikar's question back to me about health. Absolutely, Dr. Panikar. I think eventually over a period of a few years, communities have to become self-reliant in all these matters, health being one, but also food and energy and so on. My reason for saying about investments was to say that there is a certain transition period that communities have to go through to either build or rebuild their community health systems. And that's where government support could help rather than government money going into all kinds of other activities. So it was only in that transitional phase that I was thinking that perhaps state support could help, but eventually it has to be self-reliance.
Thank you, Ashish. There are two more questions, and then after that, I'm hoping we can give the floor to Mr. Neelakandan. So one question is from Professor Sudha, and it is on how can the education system aspire to be at the core of such transformations, at least locally?
Well, let me give you a couple of examples of alternative learning spaces where they've done that. Ladakh, for instance, has an institution called SECMOL, which is not really, they don't call it a school or a college, but it's a space which was initially started for school dropouts, because what the founder there, Sonam Wangchukle, on whom, by the way, that crazy inventor in the film 3 Idiots is based partly. So Sonam Wangchukle set up this institution with the explicit purpose saying that if there are school dropouts, it's not a failure of the student, it's a failure of the school. And I'm going to create an institution where in fact those dropouts are going to flourish. He did that many years back, and today it's an institution where you get the most amazing people coming out of it doing the most incredible things. And he's now setting up a Himalayan Institute of Alternative Learning as a university along similar lines. Now, what that does is it actually enables every person, every young person in society, every child to maximize or optimize his or her own talents and creativity and interests and so on, right, from childhood, and creates the opportunities then for society to actually have the options available for them once they move out. So for instance, many of the people from SECMOL have gone into creating fair price shops, doing organic farming, becoming one of India's best filmmakers. Stanzenley is from there, and he was a school dropout. So that is actually because then you get people who are change makers. They are leaders in themselves because their own strengths have been optimized in those sorts of learning institutions. There's many others. We have a lot of case studies and stories on the Vikalp Sangam website of these kinds of learning institutions that have then in fact contributed significantly back to society in ways that conventional teaching simply won't allow us to do. But that's what needs to happen across the entire education sector. It can't happen only in these few alternative learning spaces. So government schools especially have to be transformed into becoming like this. A little bit of what Delhi is trying to do in the last few years, the Delhi government. I think Tamil Nadu moved a little bit into learning, sort of activity-based learning. I don't know what the current situation is, but so some states have shown a little bit of interest in this, and we need to push that much more.
So we have thanks Ashish. We have a follow-up question from Dr. Panikar. I think it's related to the earlier question as well, which is about, is it not how much the money is spent rather than how much the government allocates? Is this not the issue? In self-management of health, government spending can be much less, right?
Yeah, that's what I saw the question in the chat and I responded to it earlier, talking about how the government expenditure or allocation in this need to be transitional to enable communities to become self-reliant in healthcare, where they don't currently have the capacity or the means to do it.
Okay, great. Sir, are we able to unmute Mr. Neelakandan so he can explain?
There is one more question from Sajida.
I think it's just an observation. She's responding to the education question.
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at India's education model, I mean, just following up on what Sajita has put there, who was it? So-called Lord Macaulay, who put in, and when he put in the education system during colonial times, he said very famously or infamously that if you want to continue colonizing a people, it's much more efficient to do it through colonizing their minds rather than using the army. And that's why this education system was put into place, so that all of us could be taught how to neatly fit into the system. And that's been continued ever since for the last 100 years, unfortunately, with very little fundamental changes.
Thank you, Ashish. Okay, I think Mr. Neelakandan has been waiting patiently. So if he is unmuted, I am passing the floor to him to explain the scheme he made 20 Kirakambalam model.
Yeah, thank you, Sultana and Ashish ji. I mean, the 2020 Kirakambalam is promoted by the Kitex Group, a garment manufacturing company which is local to the area. And, Kitex is a large exporter of garments, to the US and European countries. Now they've sort of adopted the place that they are located, and they've undertaken a lot of development activities. They have taken the lead in providing drinking water to the people of Kirakambalam. They've also taken interest in making toilets, repairing houses, sponsoring surgeries and weddings, building places of worship, and donating seeds and agriculture implements. The organization runs a grocery shop in Kirakambalam, supplying vegetables and groceries at half the market price. 7,000 families are visiting the market regularly to buy provisions. This is one thing that they've done towards development of the locality. The other thing is an anti-alcohol movement. 2020 promised to make Kirakambalam an alcohol-free village. This was a main offer of the organization during the election campaign, and they kept their word by closing down the only beverage outlet available in this area. They have also promised a multi-specialty hospital by the year 2020 in the heart of the town, which people could afford at cheap rates. So here we have a case of a manufacturing industry adopting the village and bringing in improvements for the people living there.
Can I ask what are they manufacturing?
They manufacture garments for exports, and it's a highly labor oriented industry also.
Okay, so I think this is a good example. I mean, again, I would need to know much more about it, but thank you for explaining. I think this is a good example of what is possibly a transitional phase that we can think of, where those who currently have the economic means are able to support and help communities in the ways that you have talked about. But eventually, I think one would have to argue that the factory itself, number one, needs to become community owned if they're really serious about social justice and so on and so forth. And so basically means that in these last 10, 15 years or in the next 5, 10 years, they could actually train or build the capacity of the community to take over that entire process. And secondly, also figure out, in fact, how can you make the garment industry itself ecologically and socially more responsible? So unfortunately, in today's climate crisis world, exports of garments to the rest of the world means that every such piece of clothing has a very significant ecological footprint. Now, this is a challenge. I don't think there's any easy answer to this. I know, for instance, for the last 2 years, we were doing a participatory study in Kutch of handloom weaving, and the handloom weaving there has revived significantly with young weavers coming back from industries and so on, also to do handloom weaving in their own houses, partly on the basis of an external market that has a demand for organic cotton handloom woven products, both in cities in India, but also in Europe. And right now they're facing a crisis because they are not able to actually get their goods across to Europe or to the big cities. But also because, and they recognize this as part of our study, that there is a significant ecological footprint which somebody somewhere else is paying the cost of. So I think the second innovation that would need to happen there, which would then make it a fundamental transformation also, would be, can you create a local market? Can the garments be based on ecologically responsible yarn or whatever is being used in it, ecologically responsible production processes, much more handmade, etc., and create a much more local market so that the ecological and social aspects of long distance marketing can also be dealt with. Now, I'm not saying that this can happen overnight, but is 2020 as an institution, sorry if that's what it's called, as an industry, if it's truly wants to be truly revolutionary, needs to say, okay, over the next 10, 15 years, this is the direction in which we move. So I am not in any way discounting what they're doing. I think that sounds very good, but that would be the next step of a truly radical alternative, I think.
Thank you very much, Ashish. I think we need to wrap up now. So if I could invite Professor Damodaran to please give the vote of thanks.
And Sultana, sorry, I just forgot to mention, sorry, Professor. I put in a link earlier for case studies that we're doing a whole series of documents called The Extraordinary Work of Ordinary People Beyond Pandemics and Lockdowns. So these are communities that have shown amazing resilience in the time of COVID with regard to food, livelihoods, health, and so on. And we'll be doing a whole series of them. And there's also a Malayalam version and a Tamil version and so on, 5, 6 languages. So please do take a look at the link that I've put in the chat box on that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. I will hand over to Professor Damodaran, sir, please.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Sultana. And Ashish, great listening to you on a very interesting and thought-provoking idea of putting people back to development. Because it will look strange even now, because we are all accustomed with the conventional development methodology. I think if you remember, in the 1970s, when Kerala Shastra Sahitya Parishad, KSSP, which you should be knowing very well, when at the farther end of 70s, when the Silent Valley project controversy, or what we call the debate, was actually started, whole of India and many groups from outside actually responded, because that was
actually a new form of discussion, or rather interpreting what is development, where ecology is actually important and how it is integral to development. This was actually the debate, even though people wanted to reduce it to monkey or man kind of thing. But anyhow, it is a historic thing. And at that time, I was the president of the KSSP, and I was also one of the signatory to the document that first shot the fire for the debate. At those days itself, actually, this particular philosophy of development was not easily understandable to the general public. And now I think your presentation has actually added and put it very, very solidly that democratic decisions are required for this. Your Kutch model of village women saying that we will vote for the rest of the thing, parliament, legislature, etc. But for deciding on our own thing, we will decide and nobody else will. This is actually what is actually required, that a cooperation at the community level, at the village level, and they're putting their minds on what is good ecologically and economically for them, and for other areas as well. I think things will change quite a lot. In fact, majority of the organizing group of this inter-society talk, weekly talk, are engineers who are actually very integral part of the current development activities. And therefore, the ethics part that you touched, of course, many of the professional societies here, we have actually our own professional ethics and all. It also describes many things, but taking it directly to the democratic route and even defining radical in its basic meaning, I think you have actually opened up a vista of, or what I would say, a new table for discussion on development, environmentally responsive development, especially in the time when COVID is well known to be proved as a consequence of our polluting the environment, or rather not taking care of the environment, over-exploiting, etc. I think this, should actually start a new debate, not only in Kerala or to the listeners of this talk, but all of India, definitely beyond that also. Just now, Dr. Sultana mentioned about people not very much willing to go back and eat outside after the COVID lock-in. This is again how the people's mind are actually changing. And I think at this time, introducing this kind of a topic, this kind of scenario, well covered, even though you rushed through the slides, but they were arranged in such a manner and lucidly explained by you. I think nobody ever had any difficulty in understanding the whole thread of philosophy in it and the entire message in it. I should thank you very profusely for giving such a talk within such a short time and answering almost all questions with very valid examples from different regions of the world and also from India. And let me thank you enormously on behalf of all the organizers and the listeners who actually span a number of countries outside India as well. And this has been a regular feature after this program has been started. So to all the listeners, my hearty thanks for remaining tied with this lecture series and meeting such eminent thought makers who have been readily coming and making fantastic presentations, giving a very wide area of thought for we listeners, mostly engineers, who never had that kind of an opportunity, even when we had face-to-face opportunity for these meetings in our weekly meetings at the Institution of Engineers. So this is a great thing. Thank you very much. And I'm sure most of the listeners in this will continue to be in touch with you either on email or through other occasions and opportunities. And it is in my own personal way also, as an environmental warrior whose name I have always been noticing. I think my own thanks are also due to you for making yourself available for this presentation this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. And that means a lot, because when I was growing up as an young environmentalist, KSSP was one of our most biggest inspirers. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashish. I think with this, we can close the meeting now, sir.